Okay, the first 12 chapters of John's Gospel are sometimes referred to as a book of signs. And that's because these chapters contain the accounts of 7 of the Lord's miracles, which John called signs. And they are the turning water into wine in Cana in chapter 2, healing a nobleman's son in chapter 4, healing of a paralyzed man in Jerusalem in chapter 5, feeding 5,000 people with a little boy's bag lunch in chapter 6, and Jesus walking on water also in chapter 6, healing a man who was born blind in chapter 9, and raising Lazarus from the dead in chapter 11. And John presents these signs as evidence of Jesus' deity. Well, today we're going to focus our attention on the sign number 6, which is found in chapter 9 of John's Gospel. It's the healing of the man who had been born blind. Now, in chapter 8 of John's Gospel, we find Jesus deeply embroiled in a debate with a group of Pharisees at the temple. Jesus is asserting his deity, and the Pharisees are claiming that he must be possessed by a demon. Well, Jesus denies their accusations. Then he says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, if anyone keeps my word, he will never see death." Well, the Pharisees jump right onto that statement as proof positive that Jesus is demon-possessed. The Jews said to him, "Now we know that you have a demon. Abraham died, as did the prophets, yet you say, if anyone keeps my word, he will never see death." Well, Jesus turns this right back at them. He said, "Your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad." In other words, Abraham is alive, and he's happy that I'm here. Well, this was all they needed. They were completely convinced that Jesus was crazy. They said, "You are not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham?" Then Jesus says something that knocks their yarmulkes right off their heads. "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." Now, Jesus did not make a grammatical error there when he said that. When Moses asked God what his name was, what did he say? "I am who I am." And he said, "Thus say to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you." Jesus had just told them that he knew Abraham because he was God. He is the great I am. Well, that didn't set too well with these guys, so they decided to kill him. But Jesus hid himself right under their noses and he escaped. Well, how did he do that? I don't know. I mean, he's God. He can do whatever he wants to do. Well, as Jesus is leaving the temple area, he notices a blind man begging next to one of the gates. Well, it wasn't unusual to see blind people in those days. I mean, eye diseases were pretty common at that time, so there were lots of blind people around. But this particular blind man had been born that way, and even his condition wasn't unique. Gonorrhea was a very common venereal disease in those days, and if a woman had gonorrhea and gave birth, the baby's eyes could be very easily get infected as it passed through the birth canal. Of course, they didn't have any way to treat the child, so as a result, there were a lot of babies who were born blind in those days. Okay, so why is it so important for us to know that this man was born blind? Well, since this man had been born blind from birth, no one could even suggest that Jesus had simply come up with some sort of new miracle breakthrough that would restore his sight. This man had never been able to see in his entire life, so there was no medical treatment that could restore his sight. Now, in those days, there wasn't very much for a blind man to do but beg. And many beggars would hang around the various entrances to the temple area. And that way, the rich people could do their good deeds by helping these beggars as they were come and go from the temple. It was really a good arrangement for them. You see, the beggars got help, and the rich Jews, who kind of did their good deeds grudgingly anyway, weren't inconvenienced. And this allowed them to do their good deeds in public so that the people could praise them for being such good people. Well, as Jesus approached this man, his disciples started asking some questions. Look at verse 2 of chapter 9. "And his disciples asked him, 'Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?'" Their curiosity is admirable, but you have to question their motives. They had no animosity toward this poor blind beggar, but they were like most people of the day. They looked at beggars as being a nuisance. Don't you feel the same way when some guy who comes up to you and it looks like he's high on drugs and you're at an intersection, he's asking for money? See, in those days, people felt that all disease was judgment for sin. So they had very little sympathy for sick people. They felt that sick people were sinners who were getting what they deserved. So the disciples didn't see this blind man as someone who was worthy of compassion. Instead, they saw him as an object of a theological discussion. The idea that all physical suffering was the result of a person's sin goes all the way back to the oldest book in the Bible, and that's the book of Job. When Job was sitting on that ash heap, his friends came along at the pretext of giving him some advice on how to fix his problems, and they insisted that his misfortune had been the result of some terrible sin that he was refusing to own up to. In other words, they were saying that Job's misfortune was a punishment for some kind of sin. With friends like that, you don't need enemies. See, the Jews understood that God is a moral being who will not tolerate sin, so to them, morality translated into one simple formula. If you followed all the rules, you were blessed. And if you didn't, God would punish you. That was strictly an external standard. Morality meant that you did all the right things at all the right times, and their religion had no effect at all in their hearts. So any misfortune that a person might encounter was looked upon as being punishment for breaking these external rules. Conversely, any prosperity that they might enjoy was considered to be a sign of God's approval of that person's behavior. And there are a lot of charismatic preachers today who think that way too. They'll justify their lavish lifestyle by saying that it's proof positive that God is pleased with what they're doing. They seem to overlook what Jesus said in his parable about the rich man and Lazarus when the rich man asked Abraham to ease his torment. But Abraham said, "Child, remember that you were in your lifetime received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in anguish." So prosperity isn't always a sign that God is pleased with the person. Well, the idea that all suffering was punishment for sin is what prompted the disciples to ask this question. You see, this man's situation didn't really make any sense to them. It didn't fit in with the accepted pattern. If all suffering was punishment for breaking God's rules, then the only way that a blind man could be responsible for his blindness was if he had sinned before he was born. And the disciples couldn't see how that was possible. Well, as crazy as it may sound, there was a widely held belief among many of the rabbis of that time that a baby could sin while he was still in his mother's womb. But since the disciples looked at sin in terms of physical activity, they couldn't see how a baby that was still in his mother's womb could be capable of physically doing anything, much less committing a sin. But the rabbis needed to come up with some sort of an explanation about birth defects and as being God's punishment for sin, so they just said that unborn babies could sin, and they never bothered to explain how that could happen. There were also some Hellenistic Jews who taught that the soul existed before conception. So they claimed that a person could sin before they were even conceived. They thought that a birth defect was the punishment that a person suffered in this life for the sins that they had committed while they were just some disembodied spirit floating around in the ether net waiting to be born. Well, the disciples were confused. It seemed unfair for God to give someone a birth defect as punishment for the sins that they might commit after they were born. I mean, after all, what if the guy decided not to commit those sins? I mean, how do you unpunish somebody? They also couldn't see how any unborn baby could possibly sin. And they also had a problem understanding how a spirit could physically commit a sin. So the rabbi's explanation really didn't make any sense. Remember, they viewed all sin as being purely external. So what could an unborn baby possibly do in the womb that was sinful enough to warrant a lifelong punishment? Surely the sins that people committed after they were born had to be far greater than anything that an unborn baby might be able to do. After all, there's not a whole lot of room in the womb to do much of anything. So the only other alternative that they could come up with was that maybe this man's blindness was actually meant to punish his parents for the sins that they had committed. The only reason that they thought that this was a possible explanation was because of what it says in Exodus 20, verse 5. "For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the father on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me." This morning was repeated again in Exodus chapter 34. "But who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generations? But in spite of those scripture passages, the disciples still thought that it was rather unfair for God to punish a baby for the sins that his parents had committed. Well, they were having trouble reconciling those scriptures with what was written in Deuteronomy chapter 24. Fathers shall not be put to death because of their children, nor shall children be put to death because of their fathers. Each one shall be put to death for his own sin. We also see this repeated in Jeremiah chapter 31 and Ezekiel chapter 18. So what can all these verses mean? Well, the problem is those verses that say that God will punish the children for the sin of the parents must be viewed from a national and a societal perspective. Notice that these verses say that God will punish those who hate me and the guilty. These verses are talking about the corrupting effects that sin can have on future generations. In other words, sinful parents tend to raise sinful children, and the sinful children will be punished for their own sins. It's not telling us that the children as individuals are going to be punished for the sins that the parents had committed. Sin will also have a detrimental effect on future generations. For example, the children of the Hebrews who were brought out of Egypt rebelled, and they suffer through the 40 years in the wilderness as a result of the bad example that their parents had shown them. Centuries later, when both the northern and southern kingdoms were carried off into captivity, generations of the children suffered as a result of the examples their sinful parents had set for them. But the disciples were thinking like most people of that day thought. They saw all sickness as punishment for physical sin. But they were having trouble understanding what this blind man's sin was. And even though they understood that it was equally unfair for God to make this man suffer for the sins of his parents that his parents had committed, they still thought that it was a possibility. So they figured that they would ask the person who would know the answer. So they asked Jesus this question: who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Now, John doesn't tell us how the disciples knew that the man was born blind. Maybe, they had met him earlier. Or he may have been begging at the temple for so long that everybody knew him and knew his background. In either case, this is the only recorded instance where Jesus healed someone with a congenital condition. Well, Jesus sets the disciples straight. Jesus answered, "It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is still day. Night is coming when no one can work." Now, what Jesus said in verses 3 and 4 does not contradict what Paul wrote in Romans chapter 3. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. I am sure that both the blind man and his parents had committed sins in their lives. But the question is, what sin caused the man's blindness? And Jesus' answer is, none of the above caused the man's blindness. You see, this man wasn't born blind as a result of anybody's sin. His blindness was allowed so that God's work would be demonstrated. Now, at this point, most commentators will say something like, that doesn't mean that God caused this man to be blind in order for his work to be done. Well, why not? This man was born blind for no other reason than to serve God's purpose. And we always have trouble understanding that. Christians are forever going around apologizing for God whenever an unbeliever asks, how can the loving God allow this to happen? And we're going to stop doing that. It happened because it served God's purpose. And we should not apologize for that. See, we have a problem with that because it violates our human sense of fairness. To us, it seems unfair for God to do such a thing, but look at it this way. As humans, we tend to see everything through finite eyes. In other words, our understanding of things doesn't go very far beyond our earthly existence. But God deals with eternity. I mean, wouldn't you be willing to spend a few years of your time here on earth blind if your reward for an eternity would be greater? You see, your suffering would only be for a relatively short period of time, but your reward would go on forever. Now, I'm sure that if we were asked that question today, we'd probably have to say, let me think about it first. But trust me, if this happened to you a few thousand years in eternity, you'd look back and regret that you hadn't been able to suffer more for the Lord. So why do you find it so hard to accept the fact that God would cause some temporary misfortune in order to accomplish His will, knowing that if we remain faithful, our reward in heaven will be that much greater as a result? And the reason that we find that so hard is because we seem to have trouble letting God be God. Why? Because we're sinful creatures. So we have a pretty warped sense of what's fair and what isn't. So as a result, we have trouble accepting the fact that something like this could actually be God's will. There's another reason to come out of the disciples' question. When we are confronted with human need, we always seem to find it much easier to discuss abstract concepts like sin and giving than to minister to that need itself. We spend a lot of time in this classroom every week talking about how we should live a Christian life. But if we walk out of this room every week and we don't do it, that makes everything that we've talked about here on Sunday totally useless. If the house is burning down, you don't sit down and discuss the physics of fire. If the ship is sinking, you don't hold a seminar on the principles of buoyancy. You get up off your butt and you do something about the situation. So Jesus is addressing that misunderstanding. Look at verse 5. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Now Jesus had made the same statement just a few hours earlier. He said, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. So why would he repeat it? I'm glad you asked. Being the light of the world was an abstract concept of the disciples. But now, Jesus was going to do something that would illustrate what he meant. Just as he would bring light and hope to the world that had been darkened by sin, he was going to bring light and hope to the eyes of a man who had lived his entire life in darkness. You see, God is the only one who could do either of those things. So by restoring this man's sight, he was offering them proof that he was powerful enough to accomplish both of those things. In other words, Jesus was offering them more proof of his deity. By bringing light to this man's blind eyes, he is showing us that he is also capable of bringing God's light into a sin-darkened world. Look at verses 6 and 7. Having said these things, he spit on the ground and made some mud with the saliva. Then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud and said to him, Go, wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. Now let's explore this for a moment. Why do you suppose that Jesus would heal this man in such a unique way? The gospel writers record many cases where Jesus healed people who were blind, and his methods were varied in each case. Some teachers will tell us that all Jesus was doing was making a concession to the commonly held belief that saliva had some sort of healing properties. Well, even if that idea were true, I don't think that it would hold up if you mixed dirt with the saliva. So the explanation makes no sense at all. So there had to be more to it than that. This man had never known what it was like to see. His sense of touch and hearing were the only ways that he could access the world around him. He had probably overheard the conversation with the disciples, and he wouldn't have been very encouraged by it. Jesus' comments about doing the works of the one who sent him and about having the light of the world probably didn't make much sense to him. But to feel the feel of the mud and the sound of the command to go and wash in the pool of Siloam would have been very clear. In Mark's Gospel, we read at the time when blind Bartimaeus heard that Jesus was passing by. Bartimaeus wasn't born blind, so he was probably the victim of a disease or an accident that caused him to lose his sight. So since he couldn't see where Jesus was, he starts yelling at the top of his lungs, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Well, the other people in the area told him to be quiet, but he started yelling that much louder, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And he kept on yelling it until Jesus finally heard him and he healed him instantly with just a word. There are those who are saved in much the same way. They cry out to Jesus and they're saved suddenly in a very dramatic way. One moment they're wallowing in the darkness of sin with no hope at all, and the next moment the light of Christ floods in and they're free. But there are others who receive sight more gradually. In Mark chapter 8, Jesus healed another blind man, but this time he does it more slowly. First, he leads the man out of town. Then he puts some saliva on the man's eyes and asks him if he can see anything. The man says, I see people, but they look like trees. The trees walking. So Jesus touches him again. And this time his sight was restored. In the same way, there are a lot of people who come to salvation more slowly. They seem to grow gradually into a saving knowledge of Christ. Well, the man in this story had an even harder test. To have his eyes open with mud must have been very uncomfortable for him. The man may have been actually been in pain. And to be told to walk through the streets with mud smeared on his face must have been very humiliating. Also notice that Jesus never told him that he would be healed if he did it. He simply told him to go and wash. But you see, this man's situation was different. The other people who had been healed of blindness had approached Jesus first, and then they had asked him to heal him. But this man had not done that. So by washing in the pool, he was demonstrating his faith and his obedience. He could have just as easily brushed the mud off his face and cursed at Jesus for getting dirt in his eyes. But he didn't, and his obedience cured his blindness. We need to have a faith that remains strong even when everything seems hopeless. We need to be obedient even when being obedient isn't easy. And we need to be obedient even when God is doing something that doesn't make any sense to us. We need to trust him to do the right thing. There was no reason for this man to think that smearing mud on his face and then washing it off in the pool of Siloam would restore his sight. I mean, after all, Jesus had never told him that he was going to be healed. But this poor blind man had faith and he obeyed. And verse 7 says, so he went and washed and came back seeing. The mud in this man's eyes was an irritant. And sometimes God will irritate us in order to get our attention and ultimately bring us to salvation. There are many people who have come to Christ as a result of some adversity in their lives. You see, some Foxhall conversions do last. Well, if you were this blind man and you had just been healed of your blindness, who would you tell first? Well, apparently this man went home and told his family and his friends, and his neighbors were amazed. Look at verses 8 and 9. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, is this not the man who used to sit and beg? Well, some of them said that it was the same man that used to sit at the temple and beg. Verse 9, some said, it is he. But some people weren't buying it. Others said, no, but it's like him. In other words, it sure looks like the guy, but it can't be the same guy after all this man can see. They were convinced that Jesus had switched beggars on them. Well, the beggar himself insisted that Jesus did not switch beggars on them. He kept saying, I am the man. So at that point, they seemed to be convinced that it did happen, and this was the same beggar who was born blind. But now the question is in verse 10. They had never heard of a case where somebody who had been born blind was suddenly able to see. So they asked the man, then how were your eyes opened? So the man tells them. The man they called Jesus made some mud and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed and received my sight. Well, that seems to be simple enough to understand. After all, that's exactly what happened. And since this man was standing right there in front of them, and since he was seeing, there's no reason to doubt what he said. Well, the neighbors want to know where Jesus is at that moment. And the beggar tells them that he doesn't know. So they decide to take him to the temple and ask the priest for an explanation as to how this strange phenomenon could have happened. Well, when they arrive at the temple, they ask the man to tell his story to the priest. So he does. He tells them that he doesn't know how Jesus healed him. All he knows is he was blind and now he can see. So all he can do is tell them what Jesus did. In verse 15 he says, he put mud on my eyes and I washed and I see. Simple enough. Uh-oh. Jesus is in trouble now. Look at verse 14. Now it was on a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. Well, making mud on a Sabbath was considered to be the same as making mortar, and that was work. Also, applying medication to someone who wasn't about to die was also considered work. So doing those things on the Sabbath violated their rules. So for the Pharisees, that iced it. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. Now understand this. What Jesus did not violate any command that was found in Scripture. This way they were accusing him of ignoring their man-made rules for keeping the Sabbath. Well, some of the Pharisees, probably men like Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, disagreed. They said, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? And the fight was on. So they asked the beggar, what do you say about him since he has opened your eyes? Now I want you to notice the next stage of this man's spiritual growth. A few moments ago, Jesus was the man called Jesus, but in verse 17 he calls him, it says he is a prophet. You know, the really amazing thing about this whole process is the fact that nobody seems to care a whit about the fact that this poor man is no longer blind. They are so wrapped up in their nitpick details of their religion that they can't see the significance of the miracle that Jesus has just performed. All they care about was the fact that Jesus had violated one of their stupid traditions by making some mud on the Sabbath and then smearing it on a man's eyes. I mean, how many times did we meet people who are so worried about the mechanics of their worship that they fail to see the meaning of their worship? Oh no, the lay assistant forgot to tell us to pass the friendship pads. What a sacrilege, they actually put fake flowers in the sanctuary. Oh no, how could that man come to church in shorts? How could the pastor not recite the Lord's Prayer? We always say the Lord's Prayer. Do you really think God even cares about those things? Psalmist wrote, ascribe to the Lord the glory due his name. Worship the Lord in the splendor of holiness. And oh come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker. And exalt the Lord our God and worship at his footstool. He is holy. Funny, I didn't see anything in those verses about friendship pads or flowers or shorts or the Lord's Prayer. But it does talk about kneeling and worshiping and exalting. Think that maybe we're worrying about the wrong things? Well, these Pharisees were certainly worrying about the wrong things. They still didn't believe that this miracle had really happened. So they called to the beggar's parents. Verse 18, the Jews did not believe that he had been born blind and had received his sight until they had called his parents of the man who had received his sight and asked them, is this your son who you say is born blind? How then does he now see? Now, what could this man's parents possibly add to what the man had already said? I mean, after all, they weren't even there when Jesus healed him. But you see, most of the Pharisees had already made up their mind that Jesus was a fake. All they were really doing was trying to find some evidence to prove it. So what they wanted the parents to do was to testify that this man really wasn't blind and that he was just faking it in order to get people to feel sorry for him and give him money. Well, the parents weren't any help at all. His parents answered, we know that this is our son and that he was born blind. They will admit that the man is their son, and they do testify that he was born blind. But because they're afraid that the Pharisees might kick them out of the temple, they refuse to take a stand on the way of or the other as to how he was healed. Instead they say, but how he sees now we do not know, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him, he's of age, he can speak for himself. How many times are people asked today about their Christianity and they refuse to take a stand? Oh yeah, I go to church, but I'm not a fanatic about that religion stuff. Here, I want you to go around your neighborhood this week and try to spot the Christians. Many of them are so good at keeping the association with the church hidden from the rest of the world that we should only hope that the CIA can keep secrets that well. Well, the Pharisees don't seem to be getting what they want of this guy's parents, so they call the beggar in again. And this time they put him under oath. Look at verse 24. So, for the second time, they called the man who had been blind and said to him, give glory to God. And that was sort of a swearing in. And notice that the underlying implication is that he wasn't telling the truth earlier. Then, just like the crooked lawyers that they are, they say, we know this man is a sinner. Talk about leading a witness. I mean, they swear him in, and then in a roundabout way, they tell him what they want him to say. But the beggar was not going to be intimidated. He had experienced a miracle, and he wasn't going to lie about it just to satisfy a bunch of self-righteous Pharisees. He didn't debate Jesus' character. He didn't question Jesus' abilities. He didn't even speculate about who Jesus was. Those things were beyond his understanding. He answered, whether he is a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know, I was blind and now I see. Then they asked him for the fourth time, what did he do to you and how did he open your eyes? These guys were always asking the wrong questions. What they should have been asking was, who opened your eyes? You see, the Old Testament prophets had specifically predicted that this was something that the Messiah would be doing. If these guys were really religious people that they claimed to be, they would have been doing cartwheels all around that room. Jesus was doing exactly what the prophets had said the Messiah would be doing. And they didn't care. All they cared about was the fact that Jesus had broken one of their phony baloney rules. And that's all that mattered to them. And they were not going to let this go unpunished. We're no better today. Whenever Jesus talks about spiritual things, all we can see is physical things. We desperately try to understand the mechanics of a miracle instead of simply trusting the Savior who performed it. Nicodemus wanted to understand how he was supposed to re-enter his mother's womb to be born again. When Jesus said that he was the living bread and the living bread was his flesh and whoever eats of his flesh would live forever, they wondered, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? How many hours are wasted trying to figure out how God performed these miracles that are recorded in the Bible? What we should be concerned with is who performed the miracles. Even if we could figure out the process, what good would it do anybody? This is the point where faith enters the picture. Well, the beggar seems to be getting a little bit fed up with this whole process. He answers them, I have told you already and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples? Well, that really blew their self-righteous corks. To them, that was an insult. And they reviled him, saying, you are a disciple, we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from. Well, this beggar is a pretty smart cookie. He beats them at their own game. The man answered, why? This is an amazing thing. You did not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. But if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Gotcha. You see, God is the only one who could have healed this man, and these priests could not deny that fact. So if Jesus wasn't from God, then there would have been no way for him to have healed this man, because Scripture is very clear of the fact that God does not listen to unrighteous people. It's found in Isaiah chapter 1 and Psalm 119. And the Messianic prophecies were very clear that giving sight to the blind was something that the Messiah would be doing. One example is in Isaiah 29 verse 18. And out of their gloom and darkness the eyes of the blind shall see. And then in Isaiah 35 verse 5, then the eyes of the blind will be opened. And also Psalm 146 verse 8, the Lord opens the eyes of the blind. So the beggar says, never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. In other words, the Scripture that you claim to follow says that God will open blind eyes. The Scripture that you claim to follow, that one of the signs that the Messiah will be doing is healing blindness. Now, that's not enough. Nowhere in history has a man who has ever been born blind ever been healed. But Jesus healed me. And you guys cannot figure out who he is. Imagine that. The smartest religious minds in all of Israel were outsmarted by a poor beggar, and they are furious. Remember, they thought that birth defects were a result of sin that were committed before the person was born. So they scream, you were born in utter sin. And would you teach us? There are none so blind as those who refuse to see. Well, they can't argue with the beggar because he's right. So they excommunicate him instead. Excommunication was a very unpleasant fate for a Jew. From the moment on, lepers would be treated better. This man would become persona non grata. He could no longer associate with any other Jew, and that usually meant that he wouldn't be able to earn a living. Even begging was no longer an option for him. Once he was kicked out of the temple, no one would give him anything. This was a very high price to pay for following Christ. It might even make you think that he was better off when he was blind. And don't think that this man hadn't considered that before he opened his mouth. But you see, it didn't matter to him. He took a stand for what he believed. He believed with all of his heart that Jesus was the Messiah, and he was willing to pay the price for saying it. Prosperity gospel preachers today will tell you, come to Jesus and all your troubles are over. They'll teach you that coming to Jesus is like hitting the lottery. Well, try telling that beggar that. I'm here to tell you that sometimes coming to Jesus is where all your troubles are going to begin. If you turn away from the world is going to react. And believe me, they're not going to pat you on the back for having faith in Christ. Whenever you take a stand for Jesus, you are declaring war on hell, and hell fights back. So if you have never had to face any problems that arose because of your claim to follow Christ, it might be time to reevaluate your life. You see, Satan does not bother with anybody who isn't a threat to him. You know, it's easy to follow Jesus when things are going well, but the sign of a true believer is seen when you follow him through the bad times as well. Okay, move down to verse 35. Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and having found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" The shepherd cares for his sheep. When Jesus heard that what had happened to this beggar, he came to him and he offered him something far more valuable than what he had lost as a result of his faithfulness. He offered the man salvation. That's what Jesus was doing when he asked him, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" Now, notice this. Jesus doesn't try to get him reinstated to the synagogue. After all, that would be like us trying to get a Jehovah's Witness to take somebody back that they had tossed out of their group. Instead, Jesus offers the man salvation. He offers this man eternity with God. And notice the next step in this man's spiritual growth. At first, Jesus was the man called Jesus. Then he became a prophet. But notice who he is now. The beggar has never seen Jesus in person, but he recognizes the voice of the one who had told him to go and wash in the pool of Siloam. So when Jesus asked him if he believed in the Son of Man, "And who is he, sir, that I may believe in him?" Now, by the way, that's a very poor translation. The Greek word that is translated "sir" in that verse is the word kurios. It means Lord or Master. Well, notice that he doesn't complain about his excommunication. He doesn't say, "Boy, I tried to defend you and look what it got me." No, instead he says, "Who is he, Lord? Tell me so that I may believe in him." And Jesus says, "You have seen him. It is he who's speaking to you." And the beggar's response is, "Lord, I believe," and he worshiped him. His salvation was complete. Now, wherever Jesus went, a few of the Pharisees would try to be there in order to catch him doing something that violated one of their man-made rules. So Jesus makes a statement in verse 39 that was probably meant for their benefit. Jesus said, "For judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind." Well, the Pharisees who were watching Jesus knew that he was speaking about them. So they say, "Are we also blind?" Isn't it amazing? These people have spent their entire lives studying the Scriptures, and they didn't have a clue about what was going on. So Jesus says to them, "If you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say, 'We see,' our guilt remains." Your guilt remains. You see, if God had not revealed himself to them in the Scriptures, and if he had not revealed himself to them in the form of his incarnate Son, then they might have been able to plead ignorance. But God did reveal himself to them, and they just refused to see it. They had physical sight, but they were spiritually blind. They couldn't see with their hearts. You see, the tragedy is, even religion can stand in the way of receiving Jesus by faith. John will write later, "If we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us." Pharisees claimed that they were sinless. And a person who thinks that he's sinless doesn't think that he needs to be forgiven. So he isn't. Can you identify the people in this story? Do you know people who are just like them? The blind beggar who moves step by step from blindness to sight. The neighbors who just can't understand the power that changed the man who was standing right there in front of them. The Pharisees who were so wrapped up in the mechanics of their religion that they failed to see the goodness of the act of healing. And the parents who were so afraid of what the world might do to them that they wouldn't take a stand on what they knew was the truth. Or maybe you can see yourself in these people. Are you like the blind beggar whose faith grew stronger over time, or are you like the neighbors? Have you met someone who has been changed by Christ, and you can't understand how it happened, so you refuse to believe it? Or are you like the Pharisees? Have you ever been so obsessed with the mechanics of your religion that you have failed to see the point of what true religion is all about? Or are you like the parents? Have you ever lacked the courage to speak up for what you know is truth? If we're honest with ourselves, we can see a little bit of every one of these folks in us from time to time. All of us suffer from a touch of spiritual blindness. In each of our lives, there are times when Jesus is a little bit easier to see than at other times. What is it that prevents us from seeing Jesus more clearly? The Pharisees were so wrapped up in the details of their religion that they couldn't see the forest for the trees. Jesus called them blind guides in Matthew chapter 23. Well, what is it that blinds us? For the Pharisees, it was the thing that they held most dear. It was the holiest thing that they knew of. It was their religious zeal. It was the thousands of little rules and regulations that they were sure would make them acceptable to God. So when Jesus healed this man on the Sabbath, their self-righteous tail feathers got ruffled, and all they could see was a violation of their rule. And they thought that that was more important than having compassion for this poor blind man. What is it that you hold more precious than God? What is it that is clouding your spiritual vision to the point where you can't see Jesus very clearly? Is it money? Is it family? Is it career? Is it social standing? Is it your status as a church leader? Is it your pleasure? Is it sleeping in on Sunday mornings? What is it that you value more than Jesus? Is it community? Are your political affiliations more important to you than Jesus is? Do you compromise your faith in an effort to be politically correct? All of those things may be harmless in and of themselves, but whenever we start to think that they are more important than Jesus is, we become blind to the one true God. You see, the idols in our lives aren't always made out of stone, wood, and metal. And whatever they are, these idols have no power to save us. But they do have the power to destroy us, and we let them do it. Are you leaving here today? As you leave here today, think of things that you can do in your own lives that will open your eyes to God. Jesus is the light of the world. And just like a plant grows toward the light, Christians need to grow toward God's light. The only people who can't see the light are blind people. And some of these people make themselves blind by refusing to open their eyes. The other thing that I want you to see in this lesson is the fact that salvation may come at a price. You can't buy your salvation, but accepting it will always cost you something. You'll immediately lose your standing in the world. Excommunication was a very high price for this beggar to pay. But in the end, he gained far more than he lost. He gained a wonderful fellowship with Jesus Christ. And with that, he gained much more encouragement than he ever could have gotten from his Jewish traditions. Even today, there are people who must choose between God and family, or between God and career, and between true religion and traditional religion. Let me leave you with the words of a very familiar hymn written by John Newton. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saves a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. I was blind, and now I see. Don't remain blind. Open your eyes and let God's light shine through. You won't regret it. Questions?